The drake came down before sunrise. Nobody saw it fall, but everyone heard it. The sound rolled through the outpost like a wave, a deep crash followed by the groan of breaking trees and then a long scraping noise that did not stop for several seconds. By the time people got to their windows and doors, the forest at the edge of the clearing was already settling into silence again. Broken branches hung in the dark. Dust and pine needles drifted through the air. By the time the sun came up, word had already reached 3 different healer posts. They arrived within the hour. Velhari healers in long gray coats, carrying their instruments in neat cases. A Sarati team with their mobile supply cart. 2 rangers from the border station who had come to assess the threat level. A handful of outpost staff who had no real reason to be there but came anyway because nothing this size had ever come down this close before. They all stopped at the tree line. The drake was massive. It was longer than most buildings in the outpost, with scales the color of wet stone and a body that had carved a deep furrow into the earth when it landed. One wing was bent at an angle that was clearly wrong. There was a gash along its left side wide enough to put both hands into, and the area around a puncture wound on its shoulder had swollen into a hard dark mass that had been building for days. The ground beneath it was stained. Its breathing was audible from 30 feet away, a low and labored sound that hitched every time it exhaled. It was suffering. Anyone could see that. But it was also dangerous. That part was even easier to see. The first Velhari healer who tried to approach made it about 15 feet before the drake moved. It did not even fully lunge. It shifted its weight and swung its head, and that was enough. All 3 Velhari healers were back at the tree line within seconds, one of them missing a coat sleeve. Nobody laughed. It had been that close. The Sarati lead healer, a careful and experienced being named Sova, assessed the situation through a long glass from a safe distance. She noted the wing damage, the infection, the depth of the flank wound. She was thorough and she was honest. She told the group that the animal was beyond reach. That approaching it was not a medical challenge, it was a danger to any healer who tried. She said it quietly and without pleasure because she did not enjoy saying it. The group stood at the edge of the clearing and watched the drake suffer. Nobody moved. There was talk. There were suggestions. Someone mentioned sedation darts, but the drake's size made dosing almost impossible to calculate without getting closer than anyone was willing to go. Someone else mentioned waiting until it weakened further, but Sova pointed out that the infection in the shoulder would likely kill it within days if nothing was done, and a dying animal of that size was not safer, it was more unpredictable. The conversation went in a slow circle and arrived nowhere. At the back of the small crowd, a man named Alan had been standing quietly the whole time. He was not the most experienced person at the outpost. He was not the most decorated or the most senior. He was a field medic who had put in a request 8 months ago to be stationed somewhere quiet, somewhere with open air and fewer people and work that meant something. He had arrived with one bag, settled into a small room at the edge of the outpost, and spent his first week learning where everything was kept without asking too many questions. He was the kind of person who did not take up much space when he did not need to. But he noticed things. He had been noticing things since the drake came down. He watched it breathe. He watched the way it held its injured wing slightly raised, which meant the joint was not fully locked, which meant the damage was to the membrane and not the bone. He watched the way its eyes tracked movement without fixing on anything for too long, which meant exhaustion more than aggression. He watched the way it flinched on the exhale but not the inhale, which told him the flank wound was pulling against something internal with every breath. He watched it for a long time. Then he picked up his kit. Sova noticed him first. She called out and told him to stop. A ranger stepped forward and put a hand out. Someone in the back of the group said something sharp that he did not catch. He heard all of it and he kept walking, not fast, not with any kind of drama, just steadily, the way you walk when you have already made up your mind. He slowed as he crossed the open ground between the tree line and the drake. He dropped his shoulders. He let his arms hang loose. He kept his eyes down and slightly to the side, not meeting the drake's gaze directly, not presenting himself as a challenge. The drake saw him coming. It shifted. Its tail swept across the ground and sent a spray of dirt into the air. The low rumble in its chest rose for a moment and then did not rise further. Alan stopped. He stood still and breathed and let 15 seconds pass. Then he took one more step forward. The drake watched him. Its golden eyes were steady and sharp and very tired. It did not lunge. Alan let out a slow breath and crouched down, setting his kit on the ground beside him. His hands were steady. His face was calm. Behind him, at the tree line, the entire crowd had gone completely silent. He opened his kit and got to work. You said, Part 2, the first step no one else would take. Alan did not rush. That was the first thing Sova noticed. Every instinct she had, every protocol she had been trained on, every experience she had with dangerous animals told her that the correct response to a creature like this was speed. Get in, do what needed to be done, get out. Minimize exposure. Reduce the window of risk. Alan did the opposite. He crouched on the ground about 8 feet from the drake's flank and did nothing for a full minute. He did not reach into his kit. He did not lean forward to examine the wound. He just stayed there, low and still, like he had nowhere else to be and no particular reason to hurry. The drake watched him the entire time. Its rumbling had not stopped, but it had changed in quality. It was lower now. Less like a warning and more like the sound a large animal makes when it is in pain and does not know what to do about it. The golden eyes tracked Alan without blinking. The good wing shifted once and then settled. Alan opened his kit. He did it slowly and without looking down, keeping his movements visible and unhurried. He lifted the flap with one hand and left it open so the drake could see inside if it wanted to. He was not hiding anything. He had learned a long time ago that animals in pain were not reacting to the thing you were doing as much as they were reacting to whether you seemed afraid of them. Fear was contagious. It moved from one creature to another without a word being spoken. If you carried it into the space with you, the animal picked it up immediately and gave it back twice as hard. Alan did not carry fear into the space. He carried a cloth and a small bottle of cleaning solution, and he held both out to the side for a moment before he did anything with them. Just letting the drake see. Just making it ordinary. Then he shifted forward on his knee and brought the cloth toward the edge of the flank wound. The drake flinched hard. Its whole body tensed and the rumble jumped back up into warning territory, and Alan stopped immediately, pulled his hand back a few inches and waited. He did not apologize. He did not make any sudden sounds. He just waited until the tension in the drake's body dropped back down, and then he tried again. The cloth touched the wound edge. The drake held still. Behind Alan at the tree line nobody spoke. Sova had her long glass raised and had not lowered it in several minutes. She was watching the way Alan moved, the angle of his body, the pace of his breathing. She had worked with large and dangerous creatures for most of her career. She had a great deal of respect for the difficulty of what she was watching. She also had the uncomfortable feeling that she was learning something she should have already known. A younger healer named Pell stood beside her and whispered that he did not understand what the human was doing. Sova did not answer right away. She watched Alan clean a section of the wound edge with the same steady patience he had shown since he crossed the clearing. She watched the drake's tail, which had been moving in slow sweeps, gradually come to rest on the ground. She told Pell that the human was making himself safe to be near. That he was not trying to treat the animal yet. He was just trying to exist near it without causing more fear than was already there. Pell was quiet for a moment. Then he asked how the human knew how to do that. Sova lowered her long glass and looked at the younger healer. She said she did not know. But she intended to find out. Alan had moved along the flank wound by now, cleaning as he went, assessing the depth and condition of each section. The wound was long and it was ugly, but the edges were relatively clean, which meant it was recent. 4 days at most. The flank wound alone he could manage with what he had in his kit. It would need stitching and it would need monitoring, but it was not the thing that was going to kill the drake. The shoulder puncture was the thing that was going to kill the drake. He could see it clearly from where he knelt. The swelling had spread across nearly a quarter of the shoulder joint, and the skin above it was pulled tight and hot-looking even from a distance. Whatever had caused the puncture had driven something deep, and in the days since then the wound had closed over the surface while the damage underneath continued quietly. It needed to be drained. It needed to be cleaned from the inside. And it needed something stronger than what Alan had in his standard field kit to deal with the level of infection that had built up. He looked back toward the tree line without standing up. Sova was already watching him. He held up 2 fingers and pointed toward his kit, then made a slow open-handed gesture toward her, keeping everything visible and unthreatening. Sova understood. She picked up her own kit and began walking forward. She moved carefully, giving the drake's head a wide berth, watching the tail, keeping her footsteps quiet on the churned earth. She stopped about 12 feet to Alan's left and set her kit down. Alan told her in a low voice what he needed. A proper drainage tool, a broad solution stronger than field grade, and clean wrapping material for the wing membrane once he got to it. Sova found each item without speaking and placed them on the ground between them. Alan nodded once. Then he turned back to the drake, took a slow breath and moved toward the shoulder. The shoulder puncture was worse up close. Alan had expected that. Wounds always looked different when you were next to them compared to when you were looking at them from a distance. The swelling was harder than it had appeared, and when he pressed 2 fingers gently against the outer edge, The drake made a sound low in its chest that was not a growl. It was something more tired than that. Something that sounded almost like resignation. Alan pressed his lips together and kept working. He cleaned the surface first. Slowly and carefully, the same way he had worked on the flank, giving the drake time to adjust to each new thing before he moved on to the next. The drake flinched twice and held still for everything else. Its golden eyes tracked Alan's hands, but the rest of its body had stopped moving. The tail was flat on the ground. The good wing was folded. Even its breathing had settled into something more regular, though it still hitched on the exhale where the flank wound pulled. The drainage was the part Alan had been thinking about since he first saw the shoulder from across the clearing. He had the tool Sova had passed him, and it was the right tool for the job, better than anything in his field kit. He positioned himself carefully, checked the angle twice, and then worked the tip into the outer edge of the swelling with a slow and deliberate pressure. The drake went rigid. Every muscle in its body locked at once, and the sound that came out of it filled the clearing completely. It was not a roar. It was deeper than that, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere in the chest and roll outward like pressure releasing from a sealed space. Alan did not pull back. He kept the tool exactly where it was, kept his own body still, and spoke in the same low, unhurried tone he had been using all morning. He told the drake it was all right. That this was the part that would hurt the most and that it would pass. He did not know if the drake understood the words. He did not think that was really the point. The rigidity in the drake's body held for about 15 seconds. Then it began to ease. Alan worked steadily. The drainage was slow and he did not rush it. He kept one hand resting lightly against the drake's shoulder as he worked, a small point of contact that he had found sometimes helped with large animals. Something to anchor to. Something steady in the middle of pain. The drake did not pull away from the hand. Sova had moved forward during the drainage without fully realizing she had done it. She was standing about 6 feet behind Alan now, close enough to see the work clearly. Her kit was open beside her and she had already anticipated what he would need next, laying out the cleaning solution and the stitching materials in the order she expected he would reach for them. It was what she did when she assisted other healers. The habit had taken over before she thought about it. Pell and 2 other members of her team were a few feet further back, also closer than they had been an hour ago. None of them had announced that they were moving forward. They had simply drifted, pulled in by the strange gravity of watching something none of them had ever seen before. A large and violent creature. Lying still. Letting itself be helped. Alan finished the drainage and moved to the cleaning. He worked the solution into the wound carefully, flushing it through twice, checking the depth with a small light. He spoke to Sova without turning around and told her what he was finding. She listened and responded in the same low register he was using. It had become a kind of shared instinct, the way both of them were keeping their voices down, keeping the space calm. The flank stitching took a long time. The wound was nearly 18 inches and it needed to be closed in layers, not just at the surface. Alan worked from one end to the other methodically, and the drake lay still through all of it except for 2 moments when the needle caught a particularly sensitive section and the tail swept the ground once in response. Each time it settled again quickly. At some point during the stitching, Alan started calling the drake Rex. He did not announce it. He did not explain it. It simply appeared in the low murmur of words he kept going while he worked. He would say something like easy Rex or good Rex just like that in the same tone as everything else. Sova noticed it after the 3rd or 4th time. She looked at the drake's face when Alan said it and saw the golden eyes shift toward Alan with something that was not quite recognition but was not nothing either. She filed that away and said nothing. The wing membrane was the last major task of the day. The tear was significant, but the edges were still close enough together that a proper splint and wrapping would hold it while the tissue healed. Alan examined the joint structure first, checking that the bone underneath was intact. It was. He exhaled slowly when he confirmed it, and Sova heard the relief in the breath even though his face did not change. He asked her to hold the membrane edge while he positioned the splint material. She moved forward without hesitating and knelt beside him in the dirt and held what he asked her to hold. They worked together in silence for a while. When the splint was set and wrapped, Alan sat back on his heels and looked at what had been done. The drainage was complete. The flank was closed. The wing was supported. Rex's breathing had evened out over the last hour into something that no longer hitched. Sova looked at the drake. Then she looked at Alan. She asked him quietly where he had learned to do this. Alan picked up his cloth and cleaned his hands. He said he had grown up around animals. That his grandfather had taught him most of it. That the rest he had figured out by paying attention. Sova nodded slowly. She looked back at Rex, whose golden eyes were half closed now, heavy with exhaustion and something that looked, against all reason, like relief. She thought that paying attention might be the most underrated skill she had ever encountered. Nobody had told Alan to stay through the night. There was no order given, no request made, no discussion about it. When the light began to fade and Sova suggested that they pack up and return at first light, Alan had nodded along with everything she said and then simply not left. He had gathered his kit, reorganized it, restocked what he could from the supplies Sova left behind, and then sat down against Rex's side with his back against the warm scales and his kit across his knees. Rex had turned his head and looked at him for a long moment. Alan looked back and said good night in the same quiet tone he had used all day. Rex turned his head forward again and was still. Alan was asleep within 20 minutes. He did not plan it. He had intended to stay awake, to monitor Rex through the night, to check the drainage site every few hours and make sure the wing splint was holding. But the warmth coming off Rex's side was considerable, and the clearing was quiet, and Alan had been awake since before the crash had woken everyone else. His body made the decision for him somewhere between one breath and the next. What woke the outpost at dawn was not a sound exactly. It was an absence of sound where there should have been one. The ranger who came to check on the Drake at first light stopped at the tree line and stared for a long time before he went back to get anyone else. By the time a small group had gathered, word had already moved through the outpost the way word always moves through small places, faster than anyone walks and louder than anyone intends. People came to the edge of the clearing and looked at the same thing the ranger had looked at and were equally quiet about it. Alan was asleep against Rex's side with his head tilted back and his mouth slightly open. Rex was awake. He was very much awake. He was sitting with his head raised and his good wings slightly extended, and his golden eyes were moving in slow steady arcs across the tree line, the clearing, the path between the trees. He was watching the perimeter. He was watching it the way an animal watches when it has decided that something nearby is worth protecting. When Sova arrived and saw it, she stood very still for a moment and then let out a long slow breath. Pell, standing beside her, said quietly that he had not expected that. Sova said that she was not sure anyone could have expected that. Rex noticed the group at the tree line. His head turned toward them and held. His eyes moved across the faces one by one and the low sound in his chest started up again, not the warning rumble from the day before but something shorter and more measured. A statement rather than a threat. Alan woke up. He came awake the way people do when something near them changes, not with a jolt but with a gradual return, blinking slowly and straightening up from the angle he had slumped into. He looked at Rex first. Then he looked at the tree line and saw the group standing there looking back at him. He raised one hand in a small wave. Nobody waved back. They were all still processing. Alan got to his feet, checked the drainage site on Rex's shoulder, checked the wing splint, pressed two fingers gently against the flank stitching to feel for heat or swelling. Rex lowered his head while Alan worked, tilting it slightly to one side to give better access to the shoulder. It was a deliberate movement. Considered. The kind of thing an animal does when it has decided to cooperate rather than being simply too exhausted to resist. Sova crossed the clearing while Alan was finishing his check. She told him that the Healer Council had been informed overnight and that they were sending a senior representative to assess the situation. She said it carefully, the way you say something when you are not sure how the other person will receive it. Alan asked what the assessment was likely to conclude. Sova was quiet for a moment. Then she said that the council had two standard responses to a drake of this size near an inhabited outpost. Relocation if the animal was stable enough to be moved. Termination if it was not or if the risk to the outpost was considered too high. Alan finished what he was doing and stood up straight. He looked at Rex. Rex looked back at him with those steady golden eyes that were clearer this morning than they had been yesterday, the fever from the infection already beginning to ease with the drainage done and the cleaning solution working through the wound. Alan said that Rex was not a threat to the outpost. Sova said that the council would make that determination based on the risk profile of the animal and the proximity to the settlement. Alan said that was not what he meant. He said that Rex had made a choice yesterday. That an animal in that much pain, that size, with that much capacity to do damage, had chosen to hold still and let itself be helped. He said that was not nothing. That a choice like that deserved something in return. That you did not get to ask a creature to trust you and then decide the trust was inconvenient once it was given. Sova looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Rex, who had lowered his head to the ground and closed his eyes while Alan was talking, his breathing slow and even in the early morning air. She said she would relay Alan's assessment to the council representative when they arrived. Alan nodded and sat back down beside Rex. Rex did not open his eyes, but his tail moved once across the ground in a slow and easy sweep and then came to rest against Alan's side. Alan put his hand on it and left it there. The council representative arrived by midday. Her name was Ren, and she was older than Sova by at least 2 decades, with the kind of careful eyes that had seen enough difficult situations to stop being surprised by most of them. She came with 2 assistants and a written assessment form and the general manner of someone who had already made up their mind before leaving the office. She stopped at the tree line and looked at the clearing for a long time. Rex was lying on his side in the morning sun, which had warmed the open ground into something almost comfortable. Alan was beside him, changing the dressing on the flank wound with the same unhurried steadiness he brought to everything. Rex's tail was moving in a slow and lazy arc, not a warning sweep, just the idle movement of an animal that was warm and still and not in as much pain as it had been 2 days ago. Ren watched for several minutes without speaking. Then she asked Sova, who had come to meet her at the tree line, how long the human had been working with the animal. Sova told her. She also told her about the drainage, the stitching, the wing splint, the night Alan had spent against Rex's side, and the way Rex had watched the perimeter while Alan slept. She told it plainly and in order, the way she wrote her reports, without decoration or emphasis. She felt that the facts were remarkable enough on their own without her adding anything to them. Ren listened to all of it without interrupting. When Sova finished, Ren was quiet for a moment. Then she folded her assessment form and put it into her coat pocket and walked out into the clearing. She stopped a few feet from Alan and introduced herself. Alan looked up from what he was doing, nodded once and went back to the dressing. He was not being rude. He was in the middle of something and he did not want to break the rhythm of it. Ren, to her credit, seemed to understand that immediately. She waited until he had finished and secured the wrapping before she said anything further. She told him that the council's standard position on drakes of this size near inhabited outposts was well established. Alan said he understood that. She told him that the standard position existed for good reasons and that it had been formed over many years of difficult experience. Alan said he understood that too. Then Ren looked at Rex for a long moment. Rex looked back at her with the calm golden eyes that had not held any real aggression since the first afternoon. His breathing was steady. The swelling in the shoulder had come down noticeably overnight. He was not the same animal that had sent 3 healers running 2 days ago. He was the same creature, but something in him had shifted, settled, found a different place to rest. Ren said that the council would permit the drake to remain at the outpost under supervised recovery. She said it quietly and without fanfare, as though it were a minor administrative decision and not the thing that Alan had been waiting to hear since yesterday morning. Alan said thank you. That was all. Rex stayed. The weeks that followed were not dramatic. Recovery rarely is. It is mostly small things repeated over many days, checking wounds, changing dressings, watching for signs of infection returning, adjusting the wing splint as the tissue began to knit back together. Alan did all of it with the same patience he had brought to the first day, and Rex accepted all of it with the same stillness he had found somewhere in that first long afternoon. Sova came every day. At first she told herself she was coming to monitor the case and document the recovery for the council records. That was true, but it was not the whole truth. The whole truth was that she was watching Alan work and trying to understand something that her training had not given her a word for. She began asking questions. Small ones at first, practical things about technique and timing. Alan answered all of them without making her feel that she should already know the answers. He was not a teacher by nature, but he was a patient one, which amounted to the same thing. Pell came too, and 2 other members of the team. They would sit at a respectful distance and watch Alan work and talk among themselves in low voices. Sometimes Alan would say something while he was working, an observation about what he was seeing or why he was doing a particular thing in a particular order, and they would go quiet and listen. It was not a class. It was something quieter than that. Word spread the way word spreads in places where not much else is happening. Healers from other posts came to observe. A few rangers. A cartographer who had no medical training at all but had heard the story and wanted to see the drake for herself. They all stood at a respectful distance and watched a man change a dressing or check a joint and tried to identify what it was they were actually watching. Most of them eventually decided they were watching patients. But that was only part of it. Rex recovered fully in just under 5 weeks. The wing membrane healed cleaner than Sova had expected. The shoulder showed no return of infection. The flank stitching held perfectly, and when Alan removed it, the tissue underneath had closed with very little scarring. On the day Alan declared the recovery complete, Rex stood up to his full height for the first time since the crash and spread both wings in the morning sun. The sound of it moved through the air like a slow wave. Everyone in the clearing stopped what they were doing and looked up. Then Rex folded his wings, turned around twice in a slow circle, and lay back down next to Alan. He did not leave. In the weeks and months that followed, he stayed near the outpost, near the clearing, near Alan. He was not a pet and he was not a prisoner. He was simply there, in the way that some creatures choose to stay near the thing that helped them when nothing else would. Sova wrote the final report for the council herself. She documented everything carefully. The injuries, the treatment, the timeline of recovery. She included her own observations, written plainly, without the language she might once have used to make them sound more scientific than they were. At the end she wrote that this case should not be recorded only as a medical event. She wrote that what had happened in that clearing was a demonstration of something the healer community had perhaps undervalued. That courage was not always loud. That sometimes it was a man walking across open ground toward something everyone else had decided was too dangerous to approach. That patience was not a soft skill but a precise one, and that the willingness to stay calm in the presence of fear, the creature's fear, not your own, was something worth studying and worth teaching. She wrote that the human had not done anything that could not be learned. She just was not sure anyone else would have thought to try. She submitted the report, closed her case file, and walked back out to the clearing where Alan was sitting in the afternoon sun with his back against Rex's side and his eyes half closed and his hands resting quiet and still in his lap. Rex's tail moved once. Alan smiled and said nothing.